Yes, hello outside there. Can you hear me? Okay, everybody's there. So, hey there, everybody from wherever you join. Welcome to this webinar on Pearson Online Placement Test. I am Jürgen Werner, Chief Operation Officer at University, your online learning platform. And I have the pleasure to bring you today Mr. Per Barbermeyer, Key Account Manager at Pearson, Germany. He will give you a presentation on the Pearson Online Placement Test. Just let me give you an idea how it works. While Per is presenting, you have the possibility to ask questions. To do so, just hit the Q&A key on the bottom of your screen and question into the box. After the presentation, we will answer all your questions, hopefully. Now, I'm happy to give the floor to Per from Pearson, Germany. You enjoy, bet, please, Pearson. Pearson.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thanks for the nice introduction. Yeah, so as Jürgen mentioned, we'd like to introduce you to the Pearson placement test. And for the moment, I will just share my screen with you. Okay.
All right, I think it's going to start in a second. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, we are all very excited now.
Very good. Okay. Let me see if this works.
Oh, that's marvelous.
I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, that's the place I would like to be now.
I'm having a little problem right now. Apologies for this.
Well, I can assure you that I see your first slide.
You can see my first slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So just let me know if you can see the Pearson slide.
Yes, we see that.
Okay.
This is visible for us.
Very good. Okay. So let me just give you a very brief introduction, perhaps, to the name Pearson, the company behind Pearson. For those of you who don't know Pearson yet, Pearson is the world's largest educational provider. It's a UK-based company. We have about 36,000 employees all over the world. And basically, we're an educational provider. So our goal is really to improve people's lives through learning. And that is not only through language, but it's in all other areas of life where we need to learn to further perhaps our goals or to come closer to it. So it's we serve schools, we serve universities, colleges. But for the moment, actually today, we want to focus on one product, that we have in our portfolio, which has to do with language learning, in particular English. So the product we'll talk about today is called a placement, or placement test rather. The placement test is an online test. It's an assessment of students' English skills. The English skills that are being tested with this test are, for instance, writing and listening skills, reading. It can also be speaking skills, but then also grammar and vocabulary. Now, these skills very often are tested together, or we call it integrated skills. So, for instance, if you need to listen to something, at the same time, you have to also write what you listen to. We also made sure that this test is accurate. And how do we do that? Well, we tested, before we actually launched the test, we tested the test with over 13,000 volunteers all over the world. In fact, we tested them with volunteers from around the world in about 96 countries. And these countries include Saudi Arabia, Poland, Argentina, Guatemala, Japan, the Netherlands, you name them. Because we really wanted to make sure that the test items work with wherever you're based, wherever people come from. Because we also realized that English is used as a global language, and that we cannot focus on one variation of English alone. So we field tested the test before we launched it. And all the questions, or the test items, as it were, all the test items were written by experts in the UK, in the US, Australia, and Hong Kong, just to make sure that really we focus on English as a global language, and that we're not biased towards a particular student in a particular country. And before we even put these items in the test, we really test them with the students, just to make sure that they really work. Now, when it comes to the test itself, the test takes about 20 to 35 minutes. It quite depends, really. But the results for the test you would get instantly. The test is scored on the global scale of English. And perhaps some of you have never heard of the global scale of English, which is quite okay. But the global scale of English is our own scale. It's a Pearson internal scale, but actually it's public, so you can Google it too. And the global scale of English is a way we measure language proficiency. The global scale of English is used within Pearson, but actually universities, institutions also use the global scale to measure students' progress, to assess their language skills. And so even though the placement test is measured on the global scale of English, we can always correlate the results to other scales, such as the Ielts scale, the Toefl scale, or the Common European Framework reference scale. Now, for institutions, this test might be interesting as well, as sometimes at the beginning of the semester, there's always a lot of work to do. So perhaps instead of spending time marking students' test papers in the beginning of a semester, maybe teachers or administrators could use their time to help students find their way in the first semester. Sometimes, of course, the placement test, if it's an entry test at an institution, university, could also be used as a first contact with students. And so in that way, it could also show a professional tool to the students that enter. But this is a bit of theory, so why don't we just have a look at what the test really looks like, and let me show you how it works. Now, before you even start the test, we want to make sure that everything works, because otherwise we run the risk that perhaps your results don't really reflect what you are like. So the first thing you would have to do is to run a short equipment test just to make sure that your internet connection works, that your loudspeakers work, or your headset. Then the next thing that we'll ask you to do, and this takes only a couple of minutes, it's a sample test that you need to do, and the sample test gives you an idea of the test items, so what the test actually wants you to do. And then after you've done that, you'll enter the placement test itself. And the placement test looks, for example, like this. So here, for instance, it's a listening and writing question where you would be given a certain sequence to listen to. At the same time, you're asked to write it in the box below. So the system here will, of course, check the way you write it. So it focuses on your accuracy, how you can sort of transfer what you hear into correct sentence structure, word order, connectors. And just a point on the side here, perhaps, is that the algorithm behind the test, or the system behind the test, it tests students and it really wants to know what you can do. So it could very well be that student A may have to do a few more of listening and writing items that perhaps student B. And that is because the system wants to make sure it has enough information to test that skill before it moves on to testing the next skill. In other words, no test is the same. Student A may have a completely different test than student B. And that is because it's adaptive, so it gauges towards your level, and then it selects the questions accordingly. Here on the next slide, you will see a text comprehension question. So you're required to read the text on the left and then answer the question on the right. Here, for instance, you are required to select the right word to fit the sentence. Now, this could be, of course, a grammar exercise. At the same time, this could also be a vocabulary exercise. So really, you have to make sure that I select the correct form. And just as a little tip, when you do this test, a strategy would always be very good to answer each question, not to leave any blanks. On the next slide, this is also, it's not really a text, but then the test also wants to make sure that you understand different kind of text formats, things that we perhaps experience in the public, or things that we use ourselves, such as emails, for instance. So there's quite a variety of text types, items. The look and feel of each one is very different. But then what do the results actually look like? Let's have a look at that as well. Now, as I said, the results you get will be instant. So as soon as you finish the test, it takes probably less than a minute for the system to make sure you get your test, because while you're doing the test, the system already collects data and evaluates what you like. So as you notice, the result here is based on the global scale of English scores. So the global scale of English score here of this person or candidate is a 73. So you may wonder, well, what does 73 mean? Now we can correlate this value to other scales. So for instance, if you want the this value on the Toefl scale, we can convert it. Or if we want it on an Ielts scale, we can convert it. So for example here, a 73 would correlate to a 7.5 on an Ielts scale. Now, students see their own results instantly, but so do teachers or administrators. So this is an example of a real course, let's say, of a group of students who did a test about 1.5 years ago. And so you can see that, of course, the values are very different, but it doesn't matter. But the teachers also instantly, or the administrators instantly get their own results. And here, for instance, you can correlate it right away to the Common European Framework. Now, at the same time, we can also change the view a little bit, where you see the individual students on a different score field, just to get a different idea. Now, all of these results, they can be exported, they can be used to sort students by their skills or by their levels, if you need to deal with a larger amount of students at the beginning of a semester, for example. Now, having said that, the test itself, if we sort of summarize it, it's purely online, which means it's in the cloud. And that again means it can be done anywhere that you have internet connection and you have a computer. There is no need to install any software on your computer, unless perhaps you just need to update your browser. The test itself is based on British as well as international English, because we really want to reflect how people really use English in the modern world. And as we know, most people speak English actually with non-native speakers. The test itself, we gauge it at 35 minutes, but that is actually not really true, because sometimes the test itself can last 20 minutes or sometimes even 15. And that doesn't mean that the test is wrong or that the student made a mistake. It actually simply means that the algorithm or the system behind the test collected enough data to evaluate the student's level. It's delivered through My English Lab, and My English Lab is a Pearson-owned learning platform. We host it on our servers, we take care of it, we maintain it, and it runs really well. So the skills that can be tested could be writing, could be reading, speaking, grammar, vocabulary, and listening skills. Anyone could basically use this test. As we could see on the scale, we can assess beginners, intermediate students, advanced students. So you don't really need to have any particular skill level in order to do this test. The scores are available instantly. And as we said, it is an adaptive test. So it really adapts to your level. So in a way, everybody has a chance of doing this test. So all of this information is something you can find online. If you go to the homepage of the placement test at pearsonelt.com, so you can Google it or just Google Pearson placement, and you'll find this website with all the information that we just talked about. So I hope this presentation, although brief, was useful to you. Perhaps you have some questions, and then Jürgen will also be dealing with the questions that you've had.
Well, thank you very much, Pierre, indeed, for this presentation. I don't know, is everybody seeing me now at the moment? Yes. Yes, I have a couple of questions here, but I don't think I will take care or for the answers. So the first question is the following. It's coming from Rahav. I have submitted Pearson placement. My first question is about the listening skills. I had only 2 listening questions, which are of the type, listen to the sentence and write it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in textbook websites, listening should include the following: listen to specific information, show understanding of meaning, of context, and the details of short dialogues, follow and understand, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And there is another question, exactly the same direction, which comes from a Galaxy. We have tried some tests, and in the listening part, there are no questions, only dictation. The question is why there are no comprehension questions, though in the information package on your website it says so.
Mm-hmm.
Peer,
okay, good. Well, maybe to answer the first question, the test is basically pitched as a placement test. So it takes a, as we call it, maybe a snapshot of your skills at a particular time. So there is, of course, a limit to the extent of the questions that we can do, because of course, the more information we want to take or get from a student, the longer the test will take. And so this test for the moment really tries to assess a student in a particular frame of time. And within this particular frame of time, there's only so many questions that you can physically ask and assess. Otherwise, the test will be too long. And our market research also has shown that this is actually what most institutions would prefer, that the test doesn't take too long. And so then we try to develop a test that fits these requests or requirements. Now, when it comes to the second question as to why the website said one thing and the test does another thing, well, as I said, the test is adaptive, so which means every test can be different. And so I've had already people say they've had actually 3 different kinds of listening questions in the test. And that is because if the test needs to have some more information on the listening skill of one particular student, it will ask and probe with a few more listening questions, where perhaps another student, the listening skills were tested enough for the system to be happy or to be satisfied. In other words, to gauge that skill on a particular scale, if that makes sense. So again, just because one item doesn't appear, it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't exist in the test. It's just not being used because the system is happy with what this has.
Okay. Well, thank you, Peer. We will see whether this answer was satisfactory to those who asked. There is a question, very short and great question, which is the following: can you please name other institutions that use GSE?
Institutions that use the GSE. Well, there are different universities, for instance, here in Germany, this is where I'm based right now, that use the GSE. Globally, there are institutions that use the GSE as well. We actually had a campaign, I think it was in the Middle East, middle of last year, to introduce also the GSE to institutions in the Middle East, for instance, but it's used globally. So I could provide Jürgen with some names, perhaps, that Jürgen can provide them to you or post it on the university website.
Well, that's a very offer. Thank you very much. Another question is the following: how many students can we test at the same time, which is a very, very practical thing now?
How many students can you test at the same time? I think that actually depends on the internet of the institution. The system itself, I mean, our platform, it can handle a lot of students. So, I mean, last year, for instance, we had a school that tested 100,000 students. So they may not have tested them all at the same time, but all these values and all the sort of all the data from one school alone, all these 100,000 tests were collected in with one institution, as it were. So I'm sure there is a physical limit to what can be done, but we haven't reached that yet at all. So I think it's actually probably more a question of the bandwidth of an institution. So for example, if this institution tests, let's say 100 students, and they all sit in the same room and they all take the same test, it's not a question for our platform, it's mostly a question of the local bandwidth.
Well, I think that seems to be an answer which is very satisfactorily for everybody. So it seems it is rather a technical limitation than the limitation of this test. There is another this is, I think, a very vital subject. How can our students prepare for the test? Which means, obviously, this Mr. Galaxy or Miss Galaxy is in a teaching environment, hopefully, or probably in the university. So how can the students prepare for the placement test?
I think the best way to prepare is to take the sample test. So if you perhaps recall at the beginning of the session, we said before you actually take the test itself, the system will check that your equipment works. After that's been done, the system will also ask you to do a sample test. Now, the sample test doesn't have to be necessarily right before you do the placement test, but the sample test could be at any given time, sort of between you do the sample test and the placement test. So the sample test basically gives you an idea of what the test looks like, a feeling for the questions, for the items that come up. Now, and in terms of physically preparing your language level for this test, well, I mean, best is to ask your teacher how to prepare for a test, but we don't really publish books, let's say, or preparation books for this test. I mean, we have grammar books, we have all kinds of books, we have online platforms where you can improve your language level, and then that way you can improve. But that is basically the idea of the placement test. It is really to see what can you do at this particular moment in time. So I'm sure Jürgen can recommend online platforms if you want to go mobile. There's different courseware that is available. Yeah, hope that makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another question. This question is, it came up 2 or 3 times. Is the Pearson placement test, the Pearson placement test be a preparation for an Ielts test or a Toefl test?
Well, you could definitely say it is, because if you do the placement test, and then you realize when you convert your placement test result to an Ielts score, and you realize you're somewhere below the Ielts score, then you need to see what you can do in order to progress to a higher level. So the placement test, you can use the placement test in a way to gauge yourself it could very well be that the placement test says you might be a 6.0 on an IELTS scale, at which moment then you would probably have a good chance of getting the same score when you do the IELTS test. So, and we need to be clear here that, of course, the placement test, it does not substitute the IELTS test. These are very, very different tests, also even in length, even in terms of price. But the placement test can give you a good indication of where you are, or how much you perhaps need to prepare.
Okay, thank you very much. There is still another question on the comprehensive character of it. I will try to put it together. So if this is it a comprehensive test, because there doesn't seem to be a comprehension part. But actually, here I don't really understand the question. And there is also somebody who wants to know whether are sure that all the answers of the questions are correct. I mean, this goes to Pearson and to the authors of the test, I think. You, if you're allowed to answer me this to answer this question, there is no truth at all. I mean, there is no single truth in the world. I'm sure the authors of the test have content-wise done everything to give the right answers, and if there is still uncertainty left, is probably to discussions. Now, there's another question that popped up here. I may read it out. Since you have such a test, and since our students need a certificate to prove their grade, especially while they submit for a scholarship, why your institution doesn't facilitate this for them? Have a result that we can print?
Not sure if I understood the question correctly. I think because of some interference online. So the question is whether the results can be printed?
Yes, the question is, I read the question the following. Mm-hmm. We are offering, or Pearson is offering, Pearson University, we are offering this test. Our students need something in hand to a certificate to prove their grade, especially while they submit for a scholarship. So this is, I think, again, tackling the question of correlation between Pearson line placement test and the officially certified or the official certifications like Toefl or Ielts.
Right. Well, I guess there's different ways you can do it. I mean, first of all, when you get the result, let's speak here from an institution level or administrator level. So when the administrator receives the result of the students, they see what they are. They can correlate the results to what the students need. So whether it be CFR, whether it's Toefl, whether it's Ielts, all of them, which is then a value on a different scale. Now, then what the administrator then can do is to export or extract these results on an Excel sheet. That's possible. So you would have the student, you would have the result on the global scale of English, and then you would then correlate it to other scales. Now, these results, then you can sort of have an institution internal certificate where you can prove, or you can confidently say this is the skill that, or the level that the student has on these particular scales. The placement test itself, there is no print, there's no print function. We're looking into this at the moment, actually. But then again, it also has to do with the fact that sometimes different scales are needed, like Jürgen said. So at the moment we provide the results on a global scale of English, on a Common European Framework scale. But if these need to be converted, that would need to be sort of be done on an institution level. And then the institution level will sort of endorse with an institution signature stamp, whichever one it is, that the student has the level.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre. I think I'm reading a couple of questions. So again, we do have, it seems to be a crucial question that if we are offering this test for students in mind that with this test, on the result of the test, they can comply with a certain level, with a certain internationally accepted level of English, if they, for instance, want to apply for a scholarship to go abroad, I don't know, to England, to UK, to US, to Germany, whatsoever, they need something in. The question, I think, is, would Pearson provide students with such an official letter? Would the result Pearson test sufficient, or can we do anything? I mean, we as university, for instance, can we do the bridging between these the of Pearson and the official international standards? What is your opinion?
Certainly, you could. I mean, because if let's say as university, if you have access to the result of the student, you can say, well, based on the test results as an evidence, this is the evidence we can give to that student that they have these skills. So again, we have to just differentiate a little bit, of course, because if you compare a Pearson placement to, let's say, an Ielts test, of course, an Ielts test, for example, or you could even other tests, they go into a lot more depth because they also take much longer. So the Pearson placement test, it pitches your level, and the results can be exported. They are visible to administrators, and they can be used as sort of a basis for an evaluation. That's definitely done. That can be done. Yeah.
So because I'm reading through all these questions, and we have two major topics. I think the one thing is these kind of mistakes or whatsoever, which we have to look at it. And the other point is this kind of accreditation or certification, is because we know, I mean, it depends on the target, but if we are talking about young people in the Arab world or in India or in Africa, they would probably not be interested in their English language knowledge, but in proficiency. They would be interested in, what can I do with it? So who would accept me with this result? And I think that this is obviously also a kind of homework for us to do, how we can do an equivalence between these tests. At least give confidence to apply with a Pearson result of that and that standard, apply to a study program or a scholarship program as a certain Ielts or Toefl standard as a prerequisite. So I take this, and because here I can even see, yeah, this is exactly the question, Mr. Yu. As the last question, because I see that we are not there are no more questions coming up. This is for us a very valuable an hour, or almost now, yeah, more than a quarter of an hour, because we learn a lot about the Pearson online test, but also about the feedback of people who have tried, have worked with it. And I think there is always space for improvement. Excuse me, now I have another question. I think maybe we would take the question as a last question, but in principle, I mean, we received some homework and I find it very, very valuable. So let me at that point already thank you very much for active support of this discussion. Now here I have one, it's quite a practical thing. So if I have to pause the exam for some reason, can I do that and continue soon later? And I know the answer. If anyhow possible, don't, because would not give you a really clear picture. And you know, these tests are working with kind of artificial intelligence. So if you pause, yeah, there are conditions. It happen. You pause, but on the other hand side, how can then Pearson or the test know that you're not going asking somebody and coming back? I mean, the recommendation is really, if you are willing to do the test, sit down, switch off your mobile phone, be sure that nobody's knocking at the door, and give it half an hour. Don't interrupt. And I think with the recommendation of saying don't interrupt, I would say thank you very much for, first of all, Peer. You gave a marvelous overview of the test. I think everybody who has raised a question, and I would suggest that our webmaster here would then finalize this webinar. From my side, Jürgen Werner from university, I'm very grateful to both parties, to Peer from Pearson and to the audience. I hope join our next webinar soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jürgen, for having me on the program. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye to everyone.
Bye.